Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Smedberg, with Church World Service, and today joined by Mary Catherine Hines, our fundraising strategy director. We're going to be talking about the global food crisis that is coming about as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, as well as other factors. We were hoping to have our CEO, Rick Santos, here to join us, but he has had a little bit of a travel delay. I know he was coming from Moldova and seeing our work there firsthand. We're hoping he might be able to join us in a little bit. But Mary Catherine, thank you so much for jumping in and joining us today.
Thanks, Adam. Happy to join.
So let's just dive right in. For our audience, as you're watching today's video, if you have questions, throw them into the comments. We will address those at the end of our conversation. And also, please feel free to share this video, on your social media platforms as well. So let's hop right on in. Mary Catherine, we're all aware of the invasion of Ukraine 7 months ago and how so much has changed in the world since then. But what our viewers may not be aware of is the global food crisis that we are now hearing more and more about in the news. What can you help shed some light on what we are seeing, what we're going to be seeing on a global scale, and also maybe a little bit about what we're going to see here at home?
Sure. Yeah. So you can think about the global food crisis that's unfolding right now, really driven by the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and conflict. So even before the invasion of Ukraine in February, global hunger was on the rise. The pandemic had disrupted local and global economies. It made it harder for many families to put food on their tables. As we all know, and we felt even here close to home, people lost jobs they needed in order to pay for food or basic needs. Borders closed throughout the world, where people who normally could cross borders for work or to get the availability of goods and services were no longer able to do that. And so, and we have continued to see that disruption in supply chain. So COVID already set the stage for some food insecurity. And then we add climate change, and we've had such extreme weather over the last 2 years, with alternating between droughts and floods. We've had entire harvests wiped out by severe weather, and a flood can come through and wipe out not only harvests but livestock. And unpredictable weather patterns have made it very difficult for farmers to know when to plant their crops in order to get their harvest and how to feed their families and make a living. So you add this ongoing pandemic, supply chain issues, weather-related problems that you can't control, and then you add this war in Ukraine. And this war has completely exacerbated the crisis that was already in play. Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Europe. Millions of tons of crops left Ukraine each month. And so because of the blockades from the war, that has prevented much of this food from leaving Ukraine. It's created kind of a ripple effect across the global food system. It's worth noting that this crisis is ratcheting up inequality in many contexts. The people in countries who are really bearing the brunt of the majority of this food crisis are often ones in the same ones who have already been marginalized before the pandemic. So it's our poor countries, East Africa, Haiti, places in Central America that were relying on Ukrainian food, and then who are already kind of on the edge, who have now been pushed over the edge. There's a new report that just came out called The State of Food Security and Nutrition, and it's around global food security. And it's a joint report from the World Food Program, the FAO, the World Health Organization, UNICEF. It's published every year. And if you Google the state of food security and nutrition, you can find it. Maybe we can put that in the chat for folks, a link to that report. And that really digs deeper into this global food security and some of the countries that are most likely to be affected. In fact, this kind of uh, perfect storm of the three C's, COVID and climate and conflict, were lifted up this morning by President Biden at the UN. In his statement to the UN, he talked about that this war in Ukraine has pushed so many people over the edge with the existing circumstances of climate and COVID that he's now pledged 2.9 billion in aid to in global food security aid. So it's nice to know that we're not the only ones saying that this is a real issue, but that the U.S. is taking a stand on the world stage to say we have to do something about this.
And you mentioned about some of the countries that are directly going to be impacted by this global food crisis. Um, what does CWS have history in these communities? I know we've heard, that CWS is involved as many as 30 to 40 countries. What's the impact CWS has been able to have in these areas in the past and looking ahead?
Sure. So right now, Church World Service has direct hunger programming in 28 countries throughout the world, and as we are seeing in any global crisis, there are different impacts in communities worldwide. There are some places where the UN calls persistent, where there are persistent regional disparities when it comes to food insecurity, and those are the places where Church World Service is at work. Those are the countries in Africa where in 2021, 1 in 5 people in Africa faced hunger. That rate of food insecurity is more than twice as high as Asia or Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's about 8 times higher than the rate of hunger in North America or Europe. So while we do have programming in North America and Europe, we have it in Latin America, Caribbean, Asia, but we're also keenly aware of the unique issues that face people in countries in Africa when it comes to this food crisis. There was following a historic, you talked about where have we done work and where might we be able to continue to respond to this crisis. Following a historic drought in Kenya, Church World Service has been reaching thousands of families with emergency food supplies to help bridge the gap until they can return home and resume their livelihoods. We just posted a blog post I see you've added it, where we've helped 8,000 people with emergency food aid. We were able to mobilize food in an emergency and get that to people who need it when things have been wiped out. But many of our programs are really focused more on a longer term food security. So these are programs that focus on livestock or agricultural programming, beekeeping, or maybe savings groups, so that families can diversify their incomes and actually be more resilient when crisis happens. We want to make sure that we're not just meeting these emergency needs, but we're helping people to prepare for the next disaster so that they're in a better situation so they can survive the storm, so to speak, in a better way. Within any region or country, you'll find different rates of hunger. Church World Service has a long history of identifying people who have been overlooked or marginalized, who maybe can't access other forms of support. So, for example, with the United States pledging 2.9 billion in food aid, global food security, a lot of times you'll see programs that spin up in these media-focused locations or the big cities. And Church World Service has an operating modality where we look for who's not being served, where do we have a particular capacity to meet an unmet need. So we're going to be looking for those folks who aren't receiving aid from the U.S. government, or who aren't on that main road, those who are off the beaten path that without us wouldn't have support. Many of our food security programs during the pandemic focused on people with limited safety nets, such as people who worked in the informal sector. So maybe they don't have unemployment or support in that system, or maybe families of children who have incarcerated parents who don't have a safety net of food parents at home. Rural communities where migrant workers weren't able to cross borders to do the work. So we have a history of making sure that we're in whatever country where we're responding, we're looking for those who don't have any other help but through the support of CWS through our donors.
Mhm. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You actually got to see some of that firsthand a few years ago. Living in North Carolina when North Carolina was hit by the hurricane. I can't remember which one, but I want to say it was like 2018 or 2019. Weren't you directly involved with getting supplies out to communities right there?
Yeah, well, North Carolina, we've got hurricanes every year, but yes, we did. I forget, we've had so many in the recent years. That's part of this climate. We are having more and more weather disasters year after year. It was amazing to see the outpouring of support, and we were able to mobilize very quickly cleanup buckets, hygiene kits, blankets, supplies to folks who not only were impacted by the hurricane, but the subsequent flooding that came from the hurricanes. Um, Flooding is becoming more and more prevalent as we're seeing warmer temperatures, and we get more flooding when these catastrophic events come through. And those cleanup buckets were really important. One of the communities that we have in North Carolina is we have a lot of migrant communities, migrant farm workers, and a lot of immigrant communities. And so it was a wonderful, for me personally, we partnered with Catholic Parish Outreach to make sure that we were reaching some of our Hispanic community that maybe didn't have access to some of the FEMA resources, or maybe just didn't have the language capacity to know where they could get resources. So we were able to partner and make sure that they got cleanup buckets and kits and blankets and support from their long-term recovery groups.
Wonderful. Um, so, we're talking about the food crisis and what we're seeing. And we had a chance a couple months ago to talk with some staff who are in Moldova
Yeah.
about the work being done there. And I know there's some folks there now who are still kind of seeing that work firsthand. What can you tell us that you've kind of heard reported from, and what have they been telling you about the work being done there to support the Ukrainian refugee situation that has come from this?
Yeah, so people might not know that Moldova borders Ukraine, and
I did not until the invasion happened. So,
yeah, and
confession, I'm one of those. So,
yeah. So most people know, like, oh, they hear Romania, Poland, these other countries that have taken in refugees from Ukraine, which is wonderful. Those countries are part of the European Union and have lots of support and safety nets and financial means to welcome Ukrainians. In 2011, I visited Moldova, and the people there were so warm, so um, inviting, so hospitable. But Moldova itself is a very, very poor country, and they are not a member of the EU, so they don't have a lot of those resources. And yet, what we have seen and heard from our colleagues who've been there just recently is the people of Moldova have been exceptionally welcoming of Ukrainian refugees. Now, these are folks who are struggling to put food on their own tables, and they've opened their doors and welcomed Ukrainian refugees into their homes. I think it's something like 95% of Ukrainian refugees are living with families. So not in camps and not in centers. I mean, we are supporting some refugee accommodation centers, but we're also supporting these already struggling Moldovans who are being so welcoming and loving and to the Ukrainians. So some of the things that we've been able to do, and for many of those Moldovans, they opened their doors in February, March, and here we are months later, and they're still lovingly hosting families who've been uprooted. So early in our response, we worked with the First Food Bank of Moldova to help them get food out to these families and also to the refugee centers. Thanks to our donors and our faithful supporters, we were able to purchase a forklift. They had a lot of food donated, but couldn't get it, couldn't do the logistics of getting it where it needed to go. So just an easy lift, pun intended, was to provide them a forklift so they could be more effective in their food bank. We've also helped them kind of keep up with distributing hygiene supplies and food supplies. We did a food distribution just recently, uh, blankets and clothing and things that they needed, helping them get those to the people who need it. We've also worked with several refugee accommodation centers. So these are places where families who aren't living in a private family home can go live at the center. It's mostly women and children. Most of the men have had to stay back in Ukraine. And in one of these, it was a great place, but there wasn't a way for the families to cook their own food. We didn't have a kitchen or kitchen equipment. And so thanks to CWS donors, Churchill Service was able to equip them with a full kitchen so that they can begin to feed themselves, literally feed themselves, and cook and be able to have a better living situation there. One of the other things that we're anticipating is, the winter's coming, and we all know here how much inflation is impacting us, the cost of items, the cost of gas, recognizing that in Moldova, inflation is probably the third highest in the world. And the cost of fuel is going to be a burden for many, many families and for our refugee accommodation centers. So one of the very unique and innovative ways that our donors have helped us respond is Churchill Service has installed solar panels on the accommodation center. So now they can run the center, have electricity at no cost because of the solar panels, which then frees up funds for the other things they need, food, clothing, support, trauma support. We also, all of us who have kids, remember what it was like when our kids had to do remote learning when schools closed during the pandemic. And so many of these families, Ukrainian families, wanted their children to be able to continue their schooling, even though they weren't in Ukraine. And so we've set up, took a shipping container and converted it into a youth center, a place for young people to go to do, that's got Wi-Fi and computers, and they can tune in and do their remote learning, or they can have a place just to hang out with other kids, do some trauma counseling, talking to others about what they've been through. So another important way that we're supporting the whole family. It's not necessarily food related, but if the children can continue their education, you can continue them on, on a strong trajectory to a strong future where they'll be able to feed themselves into the future. If we disrupt their education because of this war, that sets them back for their future food security. So really looking at it as a holistic approach. So really amazing things that are happening for Ukrainians in Moldova, thanks to the support of Churchill Service donors.
Wonderful. Just out of curiosity, you mentioned the food bank that CWS is supporting there. Is it just the one food bank that services the entire country, or is there additional ones?
Yeah, no, they were the first food bank in Moldova, but there are others now. But they were an innovator in the concept of having a place that would collect food donations and be able to distribute them to families, but also other nonprofits and service agencies.
Wonderful. Now, in August, I want to talk about an article that came out in CNN that was talking about Ukraine beginning to being allowed to export food supplies that they had stored, and I believe this was specifically grain, because they're trying to open up the stores for sunflower seeds and oil. Trying to give the farmers a chance to try to harvest their crops and be ready to export them. How is this? Is this how? Do we have like a status update on this? Is this moving along? Because I know there had been an agreement, I believe, and I believe the third party was Turkey that got involved with this one. Do you have any kind of status update on this?
Sure. Yeah. As of this weekend, and I think I have an article that we can put in the chat. As of this weekend, Ukrainian officials reported that about 3.7 million tons of food have now left Ukraine since that deal in July. And that was reopening of 3 ports. And it's great news, definitely great news. But it's important to keep in mind that Ukraine was exporting up to 6 million tons each month before the war.
So 6 million tons before the war. How much was this one that they...
3.7 million tons have left since July.
So since July, 3.7
million.
7
So
million
half of
tons.
what is usually done each month has been done since July. So we're behind.
So
Um,
yeah, I say we're that's only a third if my numbers are correct here. We're in September now, so
mhm. Yep.
okay.
And it's also important to know. I mean, that was food supplies that were in storage waiting to go out. But we also have to recognize that there are fields that have not been planted because of Ukrainians fighting, or because land that's got landmines in it. So a, we need to consider that in the future there's going to be less harvest coming out. So that's also going to be an issue for us. And it's not just wheat. I mean, Ukraine exports corn, soybeans, sunflower oil, barley, wheat. In addition, there have been significant um, fallout from not having fertilizer around the world. So this war has kept fertilizer from getting to some of these other countries. Now, Ukraine does anticipate that it will continue to scale up its food exports, and that it will help to ease the problem. But as we started the call, it's important to remember that the war is just one of the drivers of this global food crisis. Getting the shipments moving again will definitely help alleviate some of these acute challenges in countries like Somalia or Eritrea that rely very heavily on direct export from Ukraine. But it's not likely the only thing that has to change in the long term. I think I have a little explainer we can put in there on how this is a great step forward, but definitely the crisis isn't over just because that the ports have opened.
Mhm.
Definitely going to have to continue to do the hard work to avert this food crisis.
As I say, because I can imagine that these countries that have relied on the grain and the food supplies from Ukraine, you can't just say, okay, well, we can't get grain there. We're going to plant our own grain in the field, or things like that, because you don't know if the soil will do it. You don't have the seed, So it's not just as simple as, okay, well, we're just going to, instead of what we would normally plant in this plot, we're going to substitute it with grain, not knowing if the grain would do it. And if it doesn't, you've just lost that growing season for something that would grow there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Yeah,
correct?
right. And I think that's why it's really important. Church World Service has two approaches. We can do emergency response, which is really important. That's like direct food aid, which, like you've in that article, like you've seen when there was the drought response in Kenya, when none of the food grew, we were able to get food from as close to the situation as possible and connect families in extreme situations with um, oil, wheat, stuff to get them by for that time, to address that acute crisis. But then the other focus of church world service work, which is that long term development, is to focus on livelihood. So not just a knee jerk, oh, we don't have our corn, let's plant corn, but to think more holistically about what's best for this community, what's best for this family. If a family can earn a living consistently, they can afford to buy nutritious food and meet their needs. So if they have more, diversifying their income streams, making sure they have more than one way to make the money to support their families, then they're likely to be more resilient when there's a disaster or an unexpected expense, or when inflation makes their prices raise. They have multiple jobs to kind of dig a little harder and make those ends meet. So we definitely want to meet when people are on the brink of starvation and they need food right now. We have to do that, but we want to look at that longer term, building that resiliency, building the strength of people to be able to feed themselves long into the future.
Wonderful. So we've talked a little bit about the programs that are already in place. You were talking about both short term and long term. Is there anything else you want to touch on that? I mean, you mentioned beekeeping in Africa, and to me that was one of the most innovative programs I've ever seen, because now I grew up on a farm, so we had the beehives around the farm, but you guys hang them up in the air, and when I saw it, I was like, that's genius.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
can you just talk a little bit
sure.
about some of those innovations and those programs like
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, so we do. So thanks to our donors, we're able to help communities around the world do beekeeping. It's a great income generation. You can produce the honey to sell. The honeycomb is full of vitamin A. You can chew on it. It's good for vision, and it's great livelihood program. And in Kenya, we found these apiaries that we could hang from trees so that when there was a flood, you didn't lose your livelihood, and they were manageable, that you didn't have to be some big brawny person. It was more accessible to lots of different physical capacities of folks. So we have a lot of women who are now beekeepers who are providing for their families and selling that honey. We also, though, have beekeeping in Eastern Europe. I just saw some photos from our colleagues who are over there right now. That's all. It's the technique. You're able to teach it, and it's able to be very community driven and sustained. So it's something that's popping up in lots of places. So yes, that's one of our livestock programs. But we also do chickens, and one of the other interesting things that we're doing in Moldova is helping those families who are hosting Ukrainian refugees to diversify their livestock. So providing chickens so they can have the protein of the eggs and reproduce the chickens. Chicken raising is very low cost and easy to keep going. And then also doing solar powered fruit drying. So if they can harvest the fruits and whatnot, they can dry them so that they don't rot, and they can have them all the way through the winter. So it's a great, and also sell them. So the dried fruits and vegetables are good income producing. And because it's solar dryer, it's not taking any money from their fuel budget, so that they have food income and they aren't spending as much money on it. So really innovative ways to help people have livelihoods that they can feed their families and also sell some product and make an income.
Wonderful. Well, Mary Catherine, you talked about all these different programs and different ways that CWS and other organizations are trying to help head off this food crisis. What can our viewers do to help? The folks who are watching today, they want to get involved. They want to say, what can we do to help our brothers and sisters, our neighbors in need? What can they do?
Great. Well, certainly financially supporting CWS is a great way to help continue to do these great programs in places. We'd love to be able to expand it beyond. So donating to CWS, in fact, donating monthly is a fantastic way, because having a regular recurring gift from someone enables us to be able to respond when there's an emergency, to be nimble, to be able to adapt and innovate where we see that those innovations are needed. So a monthly gift, $5 a month will make a tremendous difference. We also are starting out now the fall crop hunger walk season. And so there is a crop hunger walk probably in a community near you. There's probably one. And if you can't find one near you, we have a national crop hunger walk that folks can join. And thereby you can walk in solidarity with people who walk to get to their jobs or to get food or to get water. And you can raise funds to support all of these types of programs that I mentioned today. So crophungerwalk.org, you can walk with your friends, your neighborhood, your faith group, and help make a difference. And the great thing about the crop hunger walks is 25% of the funds we raise go back to the local community where that walk is happening to support hunger-related programming in that community. So 25% supports, like for me here in North Carolina in Raleigh, 25% supports people who are hungry, struggling right now here, and then the other 75% supports people who are hungry in the U.S. and around the world. So you're able to help those locally and globally all in the same time. So great way to have an impact. And then you can pray for those who are hungry. I think Pope Francis said, you pray for the hungry and then you feed them. That's how prayer works. So hopefully you can pray and then act.
I want to just cue in a quick comment here from one of our viewers. Laura says, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to give us an informative update and very timely with the announcement this morning. So thank you very much for jumping in today, Mary Catherine, and joining us on our program today. So we are going to wrap things up here, but don't go anywhere. We've got a great video that's going to kind of wrap everything up that we've talked about today here afterwards. And again, thank you very much, Mary Catherine, for joining us. Hope you can join us next month. We are going to be talking about the presidential determination on refugee entrance. So this is a yearly announcement that the White House makes to let us know how many refugees will be allowed in every year. And it's done every October. So we're going to have several colleagues here from CWS's refugee offices who are going to join us next month to discuss this and discuss what this is going to mean, not only short-term, but long-term. And until then, we hope you remain safe. We hope you remain doing well. And thank you again so much for everyone for joining us. Don't forget, hit that like button, hit that share button, spread this word out there to folks, and let them know about the great work that we're trying to do to help so many of our brothers and sisters in need. So thank you very much, and for everything.
Our world is currently experiencing a massive food crisis. In 2021, up to 828 million people, about 1 in 10, experienced hunger. So how did we get here? Let's break it down into 3 categories: COVID, climate change, and conflict. First, COVID-19. The pandemic created major disruptions in the global economy and supply chain. Unemployment grew and food production fell. This led to inflation, higher prices, and an overall rise in global poverty. The number of people facing hunger in our world rose about 150 million in the first 2 years of the pandemic. Climate change. According to the United Nations, our greenhouse emissions are at the highest they have been in 2 million years. The result is an increase in floods, extreme heat, droughts, hurricanes, and other severe disasters that wipe out harvests and kill livestock. Unpredictable weather patterns also make it difficult or even impossible for farmers to produce crops. The result is that many families lose both the food that they eat and their ability to earn a living. Conflict. Before the war in Ukraine, Ukraine was known as Europe's breadbasket. About 6 million tons of crops left Ukraine each month, bound for the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Russia has also been the #1 exporter of fertilizer in the world. Between sanctions and blockades, the conflict has exacerbated the ongoing food crisis. In the midst of a global food crisis, we are helping communities as they recover from the fallout of the COVID pandemic, adapt to changing climates, and implement new farming practices. We are also working to ensure that people who have been forced to leave home because of climate or conflict don't go to bed hungry. As we gear up and strengthen communities to combat this crisis, will you join us?